Okay, can you hear me? Just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. It looks like your side is frozen, but I'll go ahead and start, and hopefully your side is working. So the topic of this debate is the U.S. military role in Afghanistan serves no purpose in combating terrorism. Now, my thought process behind this is the fact that since 9/11, let's just say since 2011, early 2012, there have been American soldiers in Afghanistan. While while soldiers have fought and died for respectable causes in Afghanistan, as far as on a global scale of combating terrorism, it really hasn't done a lot. It's really basically done nothing, because if you remember before that, during the time of the surge, when when General Petraeus was talking, when his justification for the surge was that combating terrorism was like whack-a-mole, that you had to do a huge presence in order to be able to do something. However, for the most part, you see even the U.S., some of the normal civilians have almost forgotten the fact that we still have soldiers in Afghanistan. We still have soldiers in Iraq also. However, you have terrorist attacks in Paris, basically all throughout Europe. You have them still in Syria. Uh, so all the terrorists have done since then, since we've positioned troops in Afghanistan, they've just moved somewhere else, and yet the people there are basically fighting. Not even, I'll say, no, I want to give you anything, but I'll just say basically. So that's what my premise is that there are soldiers in Afghanistan, there are soldiers in Iraq, but I'll dwell on Afghanistan, and for the most part, they're just sitting there idly by, while we're kind of fed the whole little. We're training and we're teaching the Afghan forces and stuff like that, but terrorism is still thriving and it's still going everywhere, just other places besides Afghanistan. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it to you.
You okay? I'll see how I can do this because I'm having trouble connection on my computer to my phone from my hotspot, and all my links for all this information I use on the site I can't really access right now. So I'll do this from memory as much as I can. Um, Now, if you're going to understand the role of the U.S. military in Afghanistan and how this all links together with terrorism, a lot of people, I'm not sure if you're a vet or if you've been over in Afghanistan or Iraq or Turkey or any of these regions, or in Persia or in the Balkans. This stemmed all the way back into these were basically, I forgot what let me see, the Maktab al Khadamat. It's basically they were recruiting stations, and even had them in New York City where they would seek radicals. We radicalized the madrasa schools, and then radicalized the mujahideen and jihad and all this back in the 70s, late 70s, to fight the Soviets to draw them in during the Cold War. And Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor for Carter at the time, advocated this as an approach to fight the Soviet Union economically, is in terms why the Soviets call Afghanistan their Vietnam. And you could look up articles about Dr. Brzezinski and his whole aspect to the Cold War, and he even said that what's the purpose to have some sort of Muslims or the collapse of the Soviet Union? In his opinion, the collapse of the Soviet Union was more important than the creation of possible blowback or terrorism today. So terrorism, of where all this was created, has been going back even further and further than people even realize. It goes back in all the way into the creation. This goes back all the way into the 70s. So the fact that people say that terrorism doesn't exist in Afghanistan, it's not from there, it goes all the way back to there. And the fact that we created this monster back in the 70s, funded it in the 80s, radicalized Islam, is more or less a U.S. problem. The CIA calls this blowback among numerous reports. So the military's role in combating terrorism, it has a very definitive role in doing so, because we're the ones that created it. And it actually started over in Pakistan, went over to Afghanistan, because these are safe havens in Afghanistan. The Taliban took over in 1990, and they were seeing over there training a lot of their fighters. And the thing is, what's even worse is these fighters came from all over the world to fight Russia during this war. So this was a U.S. problem, and it's an issue that the U.S. has to solve in combating.
Okay, so just looking at the news in a recent time. All right, so I guess you could say my metaphor for the global war on terrorism right now in the role in Afghanistan, it would almost be like the having a bad neighborhood and you parking the police in a car at one side of the neighborhood, yet and still there's wide open spaces everywhere else. Because while we have U.S. soldiers that are stationed in Afghanistan, like you had a terrorist attack today in Barcelona. You have the situation that's in Syria. President Trump, oh God, I can't believe I said President Trump. So Trump and his whole little I'm going to combat terrorism and stuff like that, most of it has been him worried about Syria, him worried about North Korea. You had the guy that attacked the guard in Paris at the Louvre. You had the people that were in England that drove the car into the crowd. You had the guy that drove the car into the crowd in Germany. Also, if you want to go to domestic terrorism for the U.S., you have domestic terrorism with a debatable topic, which is the stuff that happened this past weekend. So my point is, not to mention the fact that when you had the domestic terrorism where there were the people that were shooting at recruiting stations. So while you have all these terrorist attacks, and terrorism is, like I said, terrorism is thriving regardless of the soldiers that are there in Afghanistan. It is still thriving, and ISIS was never just down and operating solely in Afghanistan. So you have a time where ISIS, the time of Osama bin Laden, when ISIS was thriving, when the Taliban was thriving in Afghanistan. Well, that time has long passed. The Taliban, there's American forces there, so they've moved to other places. Like there's other strongholds like Syria and stuff like that. And so right now, the soldiers in Afghanistan, they're all but serving no purpose. It's just you're there. And in case you try to say that there are some deaths in Afghanistan, yes, if you have American soldiers in a non-American friendly country, and you just continue to send them on patrols and continue to send them on patrols and continue to send them on patrols, yes, eventually they're going to draw fire. But for the most part, when you're looking at all these terrorist attacks, this is taking place in places other than.
Okay, here's some issues with your points. Two of them I'm going to hit right now. Is you said that that Taliban has mostly been defeated and left. We were close to that, except currently, and you can look at every source and you can Google this everywhere. You can look at the CIA's reports that they're putting out in Afghanistan on the CIA World Fact Book. You can look at CNN, BBC. You can look at SIS, Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, which is renowned, Council on Foreign Relations, U.S. State Department. Everybody knows that the Taliban currently holds more territory, more than before we went in 2001 before the attacks. That is a fact. And you cannot refute that. You can look it up. Everybody can look it up. So the fact that you're stating that is kind of a bunch of malarkey and garbage, I'm sorry to say. I'm also a veteran. I have friends that have gone over there. So I'm fully aware of what is going on. Now, the thing is over with ISIS. ISIS has a lot of connections to Afghanistan because one of the leaders in Afghanistan that was destroyed, several of them that were killed during the Iraq War and afterwards, basically got their stardom and their start during the Afghan war. They all got radicalized with the Mujahideen in the madrasa schools. You can look up Mujahideen in madrasa schools, the radicalization and the mock recruiting stations. We even had these recruiting stations in New York City. There was even recruited fighters to fight in Afghanistan against the Russians from Japan. This was a global effort to defeat the Soviet Union. And this goes back to the fact that Afghanistan had a huge part in the creation of terrorism. and that Afghanistan's the rebel forces over there, the Taliban, has a lot more foundation than people think. They were trained by the CIA. They were not trained by a bunch of warlord monkeys running around. These people are highly trained. They were well funded. Some of it actually came from Qatar, which is going to be one of my tournament debates, and it says that Qatar has nothing to do with it. Oh, they do. It's one of the people that convicted, that was during the trial during 9/11, that convicted Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, one of the people that defected from the Al Qaeda, stated that stuff came from Qatar, but that's a whole nother separate issue. So when you say that domestic terrorism, there was Walt Whitman. There was the clock tower shooting in Austin, Texas, killed I think like 24 people. This has been going on for a very long time. But the debate we're having is on Afghanistan, and you keep going to say these other points, and they're two separate countries, two separate regions, and two separate religions entirely. So I think you're kind of
Okay, just making sure my timer started. So let me address some of the stuff that you brought up. Okay, so also like you, I'm also a veteran, but I'm trying not to lean on just the fact that I'm a veteran to win this debate, but there is some stuff that I do remember from me being a veteran. First, let's talk about in Afghanistan, when we're talking about combating the Taliban and stuff like that. What does a win look like? That's something that's never been described by any presidential administration whatsoever. To say that we're going to wipe out 100% of the Taliban is just that is malarkey. There are no way you're going to wipe out 100% of the Taliban. What you have to look for is a necessary win, a necessary finish on that. And the reason why I say that is because my second point on that is creating terrorists. Now, when I go back to my first deployment, which was in Iraq, there was a lot of times that there were people that were on the fence, as in they weren't really sure what the Americans were going to do. They weren't really sure with the Taliban, whether they want to go with the Taliban or want to go with American forces. But all it takes is one gunfight with a misplaced round or a misplaced bullet or some American military vehicle driving through their house, and all of a sudden that person that was once sitting on the fence is now solely going to be on the side of, hey, you know what? Those Americans killed me. They are going to be, they're going to change sides and decide to be with the Taliban. So as long as there's American forces there, and American forces and mistakes happen, there's always going to be people that sympathize with the Taliban and people that join the Taliban. That's why I said you can't just say. So that's why it's important to talk about what a win is. And when I'm talking about terrorism, the reason why I bring up other places is because terrorism is being fought on a global scale, and that's what goes when I say purpose in combating terrorism. Terrorism is operating on a global scale, yet we have forces that are there in Afghanistan. And what exactly are their purpose in Afghanistan? Is it just to train? If it's training, I'm sure there's more than other kind of ways to train at least train the Afghan forces. But for the most part, once you drop to a role of just teaching and instructing, you are no longer being a productive force that's deterring the Taliban or deterring terrorism from being there. You're just being there just for the sake of.
Okay, these things cut off a few seconds short, but anyway, I see your point that terrorism is everywhere and it is a global issue and it's a very lifelong issue. And this is another point I'm going to come across is General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, and several others that have been during this war and terror have stated that this is going to be a very long battle and it is not going to end anytime soon. When we and this goes back to the point of serving and combating terrorism, it's not just in terms of combating, in terms of boots on the ground, or in cyber, or financial. It is a full encompassing war, and it is not something that's going to go away anytime longer. And when we conquered Germany, Nazi Germany, and imperialist Japan, we decided to place several bases there, and we never left. After 3 or 4 generations in these countries, we're never going to leave. I forgot how many tens of thousands of troops. I mean, we have like 30,000 plus troops in Korea, even. So the fact that we're ever going to leave Afghanistan, we never will. That we're going to leave Iraq, we never will. It's in the terms of an old neo-colonial mindset that we have to stay there long enough to change the hearts and the minds of the people. Unfortunately, through the barrel of a gun, and there's the whole topic of you use diplomacy, use foreign aid, you use soft power and hard power. These are political talking points and terminology. And the whole discussion is do you balance it, or do you use one or the other? Do you use a Machiavellian realist approach, or use a more of a liberal approach? And this is the whole discussion among political scientists and international relations. And one of the things that combating terrorism is that it's a generational issue. It takes generations and generations to pass over. You have to stay there long enough to change the viewpoint. And this is starting to happen in Iran. They're tired of the regime. They're tired of this garbage. I've met Iranians. It's a self-separate issue. But after you have one or two generations pass, people's hearts and minds change. When you've been there long enough, they start learning English. They start seeing the country, the culture, freedom, all this stuff. Unfortunately, everybody in the world does not do anything unless people see America's leadership taking the front run of forces and having lives lost and spending money. Then everyone else follows with us. This is what happened in Afghanistan. It's what happened in the first Gulf War. It's what occurred in Vietnam. It's what occurred everywhere. They wait for the U.S. to move forward, and it's demanded and required by us. And that's something about foreign policy that affects.
Okay, so you hit on a lot of stuff, and you kind of and I feel like you kind of drifted off terrorism. Once you start talking about infrastructure and building this and how we've been there in Korea. So first of all, when you're talking about Korea, you know the Korean War has never actually ended, as you can see now, because we're still over there and stuff is bubbling up over there. There's other agencies that would serve a better purpose, and those agencies. I know when you were deployed, you noticed all the CIA people, the USAID people, and all the other GMOs that were there because the problem is that Americans they always try to say the blueprint we have for the way our society is run, that we're going to try to force this on those people, but it's not like that, because for one, you're never going to reverse the tide of the people, the Taliban that's there, because it was my experience. The hardest thing about it was the Americans. You go there and you go on combat patrol. You spend maybe 45 minutes in this town or this village, and then you leave and you go back on your base. While the Taliban, they leave for that 45 minutes while you were there, and then they return and they're there for the rest of the night. So the ratio, the amount of time that the American forces are spending in this town compared to what the Taliban is spending in this town are not even close. So like I said, that's why we need to look at a serious look at, okay, what is our purpose in Afghanistan? What are we trying to do? Because just continuing to put American soldiers in harm's way just for the status quo, or just because no president wants to be the president to say, hey, I lost this right there. It comes down to, what does a win look like? And like I said, considering the global scale right now, as far as combating terrorism, the soldiers that are in Afghanistan are providing, those soldiers could be used far more constructive and efficient places. Like, say, the American soldiers right now, they're on the border close to Russia. The soldiers that are being stockpiled in case something in Korea pops off, like the ones that are prepping for Syria. There are better ways, there are more effective ways, and there's bigger hotspots in Afghanistan. Like I said, Afghanistan is never going to go to a 0% of Taliban at all. Where we have it at right now is about as good as we're going to get. And yes, we can keep dropping bombs and we can keep dropping onesies, trying to get onesies and twosies out. But as I said before, we have to look at the fact that for every time we drop a bomb, there's probably some parent that's going to get killed, and some kid that's going to be like, oh, the Americans killed my parents. And now that guy right there is going to end up being a terrorist. So we're continuously trying to defeat terrorism while making more terrorists at the same time.
all your points that you stated are exactly the same things that pretty much every Secretary of State has stated, every expert on the Middle East has stated, and Persia. General Mattis has stated this stuff too. Former Director CIA Hayden has stated this. Several national security advisors have stated this. So the fact of you're saying that if we, let's say, have a collateral damage incident and the J9 hits like the wrong freaking location and kills like when people in the hospital. Of course, if that happened here in the States, people are going to take up arms. And then they become combatants. They become, in quote, insurgents. And this is just going to happen in war. Every conflict you have, this is unavoidable. It's inevitable, and it's sad, but this is the nature of war, and it occurs. And what you do is you try to mitigate it and lessen it as much as possible. Now the point about Korea, I'm actually Korean. I'm fully aware that the Korean War is going on. But if you look at the productivity of the U.S., how much money we poured into it, and we stayed there, even though we had to place a dictator there, we stayed there for still today. And look how, the point Korea's in. They are at one point were a G8. You look at the Philippines. We were enemies with the Philippines too. Look where they are right now. We were there for over 50 years. You want to look at also Japan. We didn't change much of anything in Japan other than we wanted. Actually, I can't remember how long we were there until we actually let the government be able to run themselves. But we were there for a very long time too, and we didn't change much of anything in Japan either. So it's very possible to have the Taliban there and to reform it. It's very possible to have the Sunni government there and reform it. We've done it everywhere. We've done it other places too. It's possible to do it there as well. And we're hoping to have the same effect in Cuba. And I'm pretty sure when Obama opened it up, it's more of a positive move. We're doing the same thing, going back to Vietnam, trying to reform it economically. So it's very possible when American culture and economic policies stay there, as well as even troops, and stay there long enough. Colonization and all this stuff, people can say just bad stuff about it, but it takes time. It takes decades. It takes generations. Are soldiers going to die? People are going to lose their lives? Unfortunately, yes. But we created the problem in Afghanistan, and it came back to bite us, and we have to be there to, in quote, fix it. So the whole thing of you break it, you fix it, that's one of the things in Afghanistan. We created the mock recruiting stations. We radicalized the madrasa schools and created the Mujahideen. We created the Taliban. We gave them all their funding. All the training was done by the special forces and CIA there. So it is our problem, and it's ours to fix. And if we do it long enough, we can solve the problem, and we can also end all terrorism coming from there.
Okay, so I'm going to say a few things. So you brought up setting up the government so they can run themselves, and you also talk about colonization that takes time. Both of those things right there are not military missions. We found that out when we first went to Iraq, and George W. had this big plan of he was going to take Saddam out of control. And once we did that, we realized, man, the American military is not set up to run a government or set up to put government in place and make sure they're there. That is why you see now, like the CIA, the FBI, ambassadors, and everything else have a more hands-on role in Iraq. And they did that, and the number of American soldiers in Iraq dropped all the way down. That's because, once again, setting up a government, colonization, those are all not military missions. And when you talk about, you also spoke about mitigating death. Okay, so we all, in case there's somebody who hasn't watched the news, there's those people that say Obama tied my hands and stuff like that, and Obama had these people and everybody was scared to shoot. That was a politician's way of trying to mitigate the amount of deaths that we made. And then you see presidents change, and all of a sudden the hands are off. But now, I'm not saying that there's been a whole bunch of deaths since Trump took over. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying what I'm saying is there's only so much death you can mitigate, because, okay, case in point, when I was in Afghanistan, the Taliban, they're not scared. Whether it was Iraq or Afghanistan, they are not scared to blow you up around a whole bunch of kids. As a matter of fact, a lot of the times they use kids as lookouts to make sure to see where the American convoys were, because American convoys, they tend to drop their guard when it's around children or women, and they use that. So mitigation is only going to go so far. But as long as American soldiers are there and they're in harm's way, yes, they're always going to be shot at. And there's always going to be somebody that wants to shoot at them, whether it is actual Taliban, whether it's actual ISIS, whether it's actually anybody. There's always going to be somebody that wants to shoot at them, because chances are, you know, they don't like the payment. And that's always one of Americans' craziest policies, that when we kill somebody by mistake, we go and pay them off and stuff like that. And that's what it turned into in Iraq. It turned into the point where we started paying people to run their, like the terrorists, we started paying them not to shoot so that we can make it look like we were winning a war on terrorism. And that's crazy.
And everybody, again, has talked about this point of collateral damage and also friendly fire of Afghanistan troops attacking U.S. forces. There's also been the issue that we have to put somebody back in power, and that more likely will be people from the Taliban to be part of the police force, part of the military. Their fathers were in the Taliban. So when you consider it, a lot of people in Afghanistan were part of the Taliban. They're from that generation. That was not that long ago in the 80s that this war happened. So I'm fully aware of those issues and concerns. Except this goes back to the title of this that you had posted: the U.S. military role in Afghanistan serves no purpose. No purpose. That's very infinitive in combating terrorism. Again, I go back to the point that we created this. That's fact everywhere you can go. It's on every type of source you can look for. We created this. Our problem. Taliban took over in 1990, and when from the point before we went in 2001 till now, they now currently hoard more territory. I'm kind of surprised you don't know this, than before we went in 2001 with the CIA, with the IC or intelligence community, and with the whole special operations community and all those guys. So this is an issue that is, again, still our problem that we need to solve and fix. The international community needs to solve it because they all pitched in to destroy the Soviet Union. So again, this goes to my point that you said it serves no purpose. Okay, there's some give and take of things that we are going to lose. There's some benefits and there's going to be some consequences. But if we just pull out and leave, there's going to be a power vacuum. Somebody's going to take over. And it is not going to be American-friendly leaders. And they're going to go back to creating a safe haven there again. It's going to go back to what it was. We have to stay there as long as possible. We have to support them as long as possible. And eventually, over time, the amount of support for the Taliban is going to be less and less. When they see the education, they see the freedom, they see the ability, they see how other countries nearby do, they're going to want that more and more and more. And now Afghanistan will go abroad, whether for sports, whether for business or education. They're going to bring back that international global culture back to Afghanistan. They're going to want to change. But is it going to take decades? Yes. Do we need to do it? I think that we need to, because it's not going to be a 10-year period. It's going to be much longer.
Okay. All right. So I'm just taking my time to make sure I don't run out, because I have run out of time from time to time. So see the part that you and I kind of go our separate ways on. The reason was, okay, so as I look at the title of the debate, right? The U.S. military role in Afghanistan serves no purpose in combating terrorism. And once we start talking about putting someone in power or things like that, those are not military missions. There are state agencies that are far more qualified to do that than the American military. And you talk about that the number of Afghanis, the number of Taliban has grown. That is because, I hate to say it like this, you were talking about if we just pulled out that it would create a power vacuum. But the same thing is happening. What's happening? Those Bedouins, those people that were once over here, uh, they've started flocking, and the numbers of the Taliban are starting to grow, and that's because of that's because of a lot of reasons. So I won't speculate and say that the reason why the Taliban is growing is because of this specific reason, because obviously I'm not in Afghanistan right now, so I can't say that. But what I can say is more of the roles that you're talking about are not military specific roles. You know, each unit that deploys, they always have that mission essential task list. And whether it's the role of an infantryman, the role of anybody else, even the role of your civil affairs and stuff like that, these are not trained people that are trained for country building. It's not trained for instructing a president on how to run the country. That is one of the worst things that the American forces have tried to do, which was try to pair up generals with somebody that might be a president. And as you said, that leave chances are that somebody that's going to be president is going to be influenced by the Taliban. But like I said, all of these things are not military mission. And I'll agree with you and say that, you know, we did train the Taliban back in the days and when they were fighting Russia way back in the days and stuff like that. So yes, we did do that. And when you say that it's our job to take care of them, yes, we have did that. We've pumped billions and billions of dollars in Afghanistan. But the thing is, Afghanistan is not a country. It's not a westernized country. It's not the U.S. It's not North Korea. It's not Germany. It's not any of those kind of places that were a civilization, westernized forces. There is no blueprint to make Afghanistan like the U.S. And so.
Okay, now the different IGOs or NGOs, I'm not familiar with this. NGOs are non-government organizations. IGOs are international government organizations, are there in Afghanistan. IDEA is there, part of human permanent missions. They're all working towards SDGs, or which are called Sustainable Development Goals. The only reason I'm aware of a lot of this stuff in terminology is I'm studying international politics in New York, and I get to attend a lot of these functions and forums and attend a lot of these think tanks and events in New York City, which is kind of an advantage, and it's kind of cool and helpful. But the State Department's there, the Peace Corps are there, the UN is there, the WTO, the WHO, all these IGOs are there trying to establish electoral reform, going through developmental stages with Afghanistan's constitution, their police force, their infrastructure. All this takes time. And when you say that, okay, develop the country and stuff, there's a group of Afghanistan people that are glad we are there along with everybody else around the world. We're not the only ones there. It's a coalition force. That's one thing you have to remember, is it was a massive, mostly by us, because America was the main force after World War II. So we were the ones that ended up becoming not just a superpower, but we're now today more or less more like a hyperpower globally. But regardless of that point, there's a lot of other forces and factors in Afghanistan than just the U.S. military. And we have had success. We had that in Korea, and we've been successful. We had it in the Philippines, and it's successful. Philippines actually, despite the corruption, has a very functioning government there that was set up by us. The BIR, which is what we call the IRS, we called it the Bureau of Internal Revenues there. And you can look that up as well, too. They have a functioning government because of us. Their constitution is very close to ours. The Korean and Japanese and German is very close, similar to ours, also as well, too. So the military, along with the State Department, work in tandem to deal with this, just like the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and and Defense Intelligence work in tandem together, just like the DSS works in tandem with the FBI and DEA and all those other groups to deal with international law enforcement issues. So the State Department and all these other IGOs and the military all work together to help establish governments and work on sustainable development goals for the future, whether it's bilateral agreements with neighboring countries or trade deals, or let's say implementing education. It's a multi-conglomerate issue that works.
Okay, So in my closing statements, first I want to say thank you to my opponent. It has been awesome debating with you. Hey, I look forward to debating you again. Now for my last 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Okay, so when you're talking about stuff like USAID there, and the State Department is there, and other IGOs are there, and they're helping with the police force and infrastructure, and there's also the United Nations there. Okay, and you say it's a coalition. When I was in Afghanistan the last time, I was on. I'm sorry, Iraq the last time. I was on the brigade staff, and when I got there was a printout, a nice little slide of the American forces, this coalition that was there helping, and I just remember looking at the number of the amount of German soldiers that were in theater contributing to this coalition, and the number was 7. So the American forces had like millions, and the German army had 7. And I say to say this, okay? So once again, I keep saying that the role, the job, the mission, and the purpose in Afghanistan right now has shifted more or less to government building and creating infrastructure and doing projects to help them grow grass and doing greenhouses and stuff like that. All of which are not jobs that the American Army, the American military is trained to do. Basically, what the American military is doing are only standing there just for the sake of standing there. As far as combating terrorism, not building countries, not doing infrastructure, not training the police force. Because I remember even before when it was time to train the police force, we were getting IPAs. You know, we were having retired policemen from the United States fly over to Afghanistan or Iraq just to train up the police force because the American military was not equipped to be able to train the police force. And that's the reality of it. The reality of it is terrorism as a whole, on a global scale, the way it is, the purpose for the United States military in Afghanistan has gone from being very important and very, 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 very important to the mission of combating global terrorism to now where it's just like, man, are there still soldiers in Afghanistan? I almost forgot that there were still soldiers over there. What are they doing over there? And to me, that shows that they have no purpose. And it's because, like I said, the mission is no longer a kinetic shoot the bad guy and do stuff like that. It is propping up the Afghanistan government so they can govern themselves.
There's still a purpose there because they can be created as a safe haven for them. And and the thing is, you have to understand is there's something called actors in the world of politics and foreign relations. And there are many different actors, just as Musharraf in Pakistan, who overthrew an elected government. He's a political actor. Ahmed Karzai is a political actor. Bin Laden also is sort of like a ghost political entity actor that has a lot of control and influence still in Afghanistan today. He's a very influential figure. He's dead, but he's still a very influential figure, a martyr that they look up to. So there's several factors of individuals that people look up to in these countries that you also have to work on and deal with. Now, there's something else that I don't think you're generally aware of. And in Afghanistan, one of the issues and points that people have to think about is that this is a makeup of many tribes and nations. And most of these countries were created by Western powers after World War I. So to combat terrorism, you have to be aware of where these nations are. And if you look at the borders sliced up on land where just nations of people are, the borders are a mess. It looks terrible. And these borders go between cave passages in Afghanistan. Some nations' borders with the Urdu go all the way into Pakistan, and they cross back and forth all the time. So to combat terrorism in Afghanistan, they have to be there because if they deal, let's say they deal with in Afghanistan, they're going to cross over from Pakistan already. That's how Bin Laden went into Pakistan right after the war. So yes, we have to be there to combat it because